Okay, good afternoon, all of you. Let us continue with the topic which we had already covered up in the previous class. Okay, so we had discussed about hypothesis. I hope you all have remembered about hypothesis, different types of hypothesis with their examples and the meaning. So today we are going to see the variables. What do you mean by variables? Okay, and what are the different types of variables? So yesterday when we were discussing that hypothesis, we are going to assume or tentatively we are going to explain or describe the existing relationship between the two phenomena, that is the independent and the dependent variables. Okay, so based on that we can see variables are of different types like hypothesis, independent variable, dependent variable, extraneous variable, environmental variable and the demographic variables. All these things we will see one by one. So the independent variable, from the name itself you come to know the variable which is not dependent on any cause or effect or treatment or outcome. Is it not? It is totally independent. If there is any change in the independent variable takes place, if there is any manipulation takes place in the independent variable, then we can see its effect on the dependent variable. So manipulation or change or control means what? Like we have two groups, experimental group and the control group. So to the experimental group we might have given executed the intervention, and for the control group we have not given any intervention. So that is how we are controlling the independent variables, interventions, execution in either experimental group or in the control group. Okay. So you can see here it is a quality or a property that can be manipulated, as I told you, like when to give, when to not give, okay, when to stop giving the intervention. That is what by the researcher, the investigator who is going to do the research, okay, to cause and effect on the dependent variable, to see what is its cause or the impact or the effect it will take place when we control the execution of the independent variable. Clear to all of you? And that is how you can see it has got an impact on the dependent variable. So it is also called experimental variable or treatment variable. Remember this, independent variable is also called as the experimental variable or the treatment variable. So based on the treatment, like when we treat the patient by giving some medicines or by giving some nursing interventions, we definitely see the outcome on the patient as a form of evaluation in the nursing process, and the outcome may be positive or may be negative, and that depends on the treatment. So treatment is nothing but the independent variable which which will be having an impact, greatest impact on the dependent variable. So based on the manipulation or change in the independent variable, we can see its impact on the dependent variable. And that is why these independent variables are also called as research variables or treatment variables. Clear? Next is dependent variable. Dependent variable means what? Just the opposite of independent, which is totally dependent on the independent variable. Based on its implication or execution of the independent variable, you can see a huge change or difference in the dependent variable. Like for example, it is also called as a property or a quality, behavior or outcome that the researcher predicts and that occurs in response to the manipulation. Whenever you are manipulating the independent variable, you are seeing its changes or effects in the dependent variable. So either it is an experimentation or treatment of the independent variable, whether you are giving it the independent variable in the form of treatment or in the form of experimental intervention, okay, it is also called as the outcome variable. So dependent variable is the outcome variable, independent variable is the treatment variable or research variable, and dependent variable is the outcome variable. Why it is called as outcome? It is a result oriented variable. Why? Because based on the execution or manipulation or implementation of the independent variable, you can see its impact or effect on the dependent variable. That is why the name has come as dependent variable. The dependent variable's outcome is totally dependent on the manipulation or execution of the independent variable. Fine. So, for example, you can see oxygen administration to a highly nervous patient who is highly nervous, you have administered oxygen by a face mask instead of a nasal cannula. We all know oxygen administration can be done in various ways. Either you can give it with the oxygen hood or with the oxygen mask, nasal cannula, nasal pongs. There are many ways, is it not, through which we can administer the oxygen. So here the oxygen is being administered by a face mask instead of a nasal cannula will cause less anxiety to the patient. Okay, nasal cannula के बदले अगर आप face mask में दोगे, the patient will having a less anxiety because cannulas are something which goes inside the nostril, which may cause difficulty, discomfort in the patient. Patient may more think psychologically that something is an obstruction as a nasal cannula, and because of which again oxygen is getting inside less. But if you put a mask, then it is covering the whole face, I mean the mouth and the nose, and there is no obstruction that something plastic tubings are getting inside it, the nasal nostrils, and that is how you can see patient will not have any interruption. Only thing you have to regulate and monitor how much liters per minute of oxygen you are administering to the patient. Okay, so this is one example. Now in this you see, in this above example, the independent variable, that is method of oxygen administration. Do you agree with me? How you are administering the oxygen. Method of administering oxygen is your independent variable. The way you administer the oxygen, it will have an impact on the nervousness of the patient. That is a dependent variable. So you can see here the independent variable, that is method of oxygen administration by face mask, cause an effect on the dependent variable, that is the patient state of anxiety. If you give the oxygen administration through the face mask, patient will have less anxiety. So, administration of oxygen through face mask is a independent variable, and the anxiety state or anxiety level of the patient is the dependent variable. Yes or no? Yes. So, if you are administering with nasal pongs or cannulas, you will see the anxiety level of the patient will become more. In this independent variable, that is method of oxygen administration is manipulated. That means you are controlling, okay, the execution and the implementation of oxygen. Maybe you are giving the oxygen to the experimental group through the nasal mask, face mask, and you are administering the oxygen to the control group with the nasal cannula. And you can see the differences that independent variable, when it is been administered in the form of oxygen administration through face mask, the anxiety state of the patient is less. So, anxiety state of the patient is a dependent variable. Whereas, when the administration of oxygen is given through the nasal cannula, the dependent variable, that is anxiety level of the patient, is comparatively higher, okay, in the control group than in the experimental group. That is what you can see here. Manipulation of the independent variable will have an impact on the dependent variable. So, because oxygen instead of face mask may also be administered by a nasal cannula, and this may cause an influence on the dependent variable, or there may be different outcomes such as the patient's state of anxiety may be increased. So, based on the administration of oxygen in the form of nasal cannula, the state of anxiety increases in the patient. Clear? Next is the affects change in the independent variable and the dependent variable. So, you see, when you are administering the independent variable, what is happening? There is a change takes place. Where the change is taking place? In the dependent variable. It must get some change, otherwise you can't say that this is a independent variable. Independent variable, whenever you are applying, definitely it will have some changes, some impact on the dependent variable. Next is extraneous variable. Have you heard about it? you might have used also for your research study, extraneous variables. Okay. Now, extraneous variables are those variables which is not an independent or dependent variable, but it will have an indirect impact on the result or outcome of the independent variable's impact. So, these are the variables which confuse or mix up the relationship between the variables and also interfere with the rational or cause relationship between the independent and dependent variable. Like for example, certain variables, example age, gender, socioeconomic status, family income, source of information. These are certain variables which are called as extraneous variables. That means these variables are not in your control. The researcher has no control on these variables. And these variables will have an impact on the relationship between the dependent and the independent variable. For example, age. Can you change the age and manipulate the age during the study? You can't. For example, socioeconomic status. You can't change the socioeconomic status of the sample, which is not within your control. Type of house. Which type of house they're staying? Can you change that? Construction of the house or the interior part of the house? No. Same way, income. What is the family income of that particular participant or the sample? Can you change that for your study sake, for your study purpose? No. So that means what? These are beyond your control. But it will have an impact on your relationship between the independent and dependent variable. Yes, simple example, you want to assess the level of knowledge about nutrition among the mothers of XYZ village. And in that you might have seen, you might have seen that the mothers whom you have selected, their educational status is very poor. They are illiterate. Okay, so this is having an impact on your independent and dependent variable. How? Illiterate mothers, they don't have knowledge what are the nutritious food items, or how to maintain the hygiene of the food, how to do the cooking methods to preserve the nutrients in the foods. Is it not, like we say, steaming, boiling? These are the different methods through which we can preserve. Rather than deep frying or roasting, it will cause lot of wastage of the nutritious materials from the food items. Is it not? But as they are ignorant, as they are innocent, as they don't have their literacy rate, so this is how it has got an impact that their children also will be neglected from the nutritional part. If you are educated, then only you can educate your children or your offsprings or the siblings or whoever is there near to you. So that is why this literacy rate is not under your control. The samples whom you have taken may be literate, may not be literate. So educational status is one of the factor which we always assess before we start giving the implementation, so that we will come to know that education is also one of the factor which is associated with the pre-test level of knowledge scores as well as post-test level of knowledge scores. Pre-test level, you have seen before giving the intervention, they have no knowledge. So there is an association, chi-square will come between the pre-test level of knowledge scores and the socio-economic factors or the extraneous variables. Similarly, once you give the intervention, again you take the post-test, you might have seen it's a good result because their knowledge has been increased. So you can say now that there is a association, significant association is present or positive association is present between the post-test level of knowledge scores and the extraneous variables. So this is what we have to find out. What is extraneous variables? The variables which are not within our control, but they interfere and they confuse the results between the relationship of dependent and independent variable. Okay. Next is what you can see. What happened to you? The researchers make an attempt to identify those extraneous variables. Sometimes what happens, we try to take an attempt to identify what are the extraneous variables are present. and we see to some extent how we can take it out, take off from our main study. Certain variables you can do some constraints, like in the experimental study, we are doing it in the lab. So in the lab, what happens? We are preparing a very, very scientific method of an environment, conducive environment, which is only suitable where no extraneous variables will have the interventions. Artificial kind of environment you are creating in the lab to avoid the contact of the extraneous variables. But when you do these studies in the community setup, maybe in the schools, in the colleges, or in the hospitals, or in the different old age homes, wherever you do the study, can you control those variables? You can't create any artificial environment. You have to do the study in a natural environment, is it not? So when you do the study in the natural environment, in the natural setting, all the extraneous variables will come in contact with your study. So that is why those variables which you can't control, but they are in contact with your study, making some impact of changes between the relationship of independent and dependent variables, they are called as your limitations of the study, because you can't control, but it is affecting your study. So this is one of the limitation of my study, that the results what we got, it is may not be all 100% accurate, apart from experimental type of study where we are creating a research setting, it is appropriate and conducive for the study, and there is no intravenous extraneous variables are in contact, so there is no confusion, there is no interference, and the result is perfectly the accurate one. Okay. One example you can see here, a calm and quiet environment at bedtime, at night, will allow sound sleep to a patient in a general ward. Yes, conducive environment we are creating, switching off the light, no making of noises, putting off, turning off the alarm of the gadgets, okay, in the ICUs and all. So here what happens, you are trying to create a conducive environment for sleep of the patient. You are maybe giving some warm milk to the patient before going to bed, you are doing some foot reflexology, so that the you are just putting pressure on the nerve ending points to induce the sleep in the patient. Fine. So in the above example, the independent variable calm and quiet environment will have an effect on the dependent variable, that is sleep of the patient at night. Yes, the more you create a calm and quiet environment which is independent variable, the better and the sound sleep will be there in the patient, which is the dependent variable. So change or manipulation in the independent variable will have the result oriented either positive or negative on the impact of the dependent variable or outcome of the dependent variable. Now what is environmental variable? Related to environment, okay, are the variables which compose a research setting where the research study is conducted. Environmental variable, the place, the setting where you are going to study the your data collection you are going to do. These variables are climate. Can you change climate? You can't. These variables are family background. Any hereditary disease of the family, any genetic disease of the family, can you change it? You can't. It is not in your hand. Okay. Social background, as I told you, related to finance part of it. Institution setup, in which institution they have been put up for their education. Okay. Community setup, what is the place of habitat of that particular sample in the community, whether it is urban, whether it is rural, whether it is semi-urban, semi-rural, whether it is high-tech cities, whether it is capital of India, where they are residing. That also has an impact, because the population or the crowd of that place will have an impact on the person who is staying there. Yes, a convent educated student's knowledge, thinking, attitude will be totally different from a government educated school child. Why? Because the environment, the setup, the crowd, the people with whom they have interacted are of different kinds. So that has an impact. Next is what these variables are also some types of extraneous variables. Like we have seen extraneous variables which can interfere into the study. which are not within our control. Same way, environmental variables are also can't be controlled, can interfere with the study, and can manipulate or have an impact on the relationship finding out between the independent and the dependent variable. Clear? So, in a descriptive or correlation research study, descriptive means what? Vividly, when you do the descriptions of a particular community, you go now to the community to see what is their culture, custom, rituals, food habits, living style, educational status, all these things we see, yes, of a particular community. You might have seen in the Discovery channels, they show plenty of these African communities, tribals, is it not? Their way of living, they pray, they worship to which god, how their marriages takes place, what are the birth bearing ceremonies. You see so many things they show. So these people, they are the researchers. They have stayed years together with that particular community. For example, Maasai community, so many communities are there in African tribal society. So they have stayed years together with them and they identified how they are living their each day of the life. What are the struggles they have? What are the other aspects they are doing? And what they are performing, why they are performing? Because of the geographical condition. If you go to Rajasthan, you will see in hot season people they wear fully covered dress. Why? Because of the loo. But in south, if you go, South India, in the hot season, they don't wear fully covered dress because of the humid climate, sweating. So this is how the dressing style also gets changed based on the geographical area or the condition where we are staying. Our food habits, it is also based on the geographical condition. The people who stay in Rajasthan, they eat lot of wheat, jowar, bajra because it's a dry climate. You don't able to grow the or cultivate the crops like rice. But if you go to the coastal part of the India, you will see all of them are rice eaters. 3 times a day they are eating rice because that is only available there. So their food habits are also being developed according to that. And this is what is called as descriptive. You are describing one particular community or one particular communal group or religious group in terms of their living areas, habits, performances. All it depends on the geographical condition. Even the cultures also. That is why when the people move from India to abroad, they get sometimes cultural shock. The way they have been brought up in their society was not the same like us. So there may be sometimes cultural shock. It can happen. So these things has to be taken care before when the people start migrating from one country to another country. So descriptive or correlational research study where the study is conducted in a natural setting, as I told you, in the community, and where it is necessary to study the subjects about a natural behavior, as I told you just now. The sense of dressing depends upon the geographical condition. The food habits depends upon the geographical condition. Okay. The lifestyles depends upon the geographical condition. So these are the important things. And the researchers makes no attempt to control whatever is happening in that society. They are just observing and noting it down. They are not questioning why you are doing like this. It has to be like this scientifically. No, because that is their religious performance, their rituals, their customs. You have to just note down and gather information about that community. That is why you have to have a lot of observational method through which you can identify whole day, years together, what they are doing, how they are performing, and why it is happening like this. Okay. And there is some alter in the variables of the environment can take place. Now demographic variables means what? Three variables we have seen. Extraneous variable, first one. Second one was environmental variable, and now the third one is the demographic variable, apart from your independent and dependent variable. So these are the qualities or property, okay, or characteristics of a subject. Subject means the samples. We can also tell them as subjects or participants, okay, or pupils. under the research study and which are connected to describe the sample, like educational status. What is your educational status? You are one of the sample for this study. So your educational status may be BSc third year, BSc fourth year, graduate, postgraduate, primary level education, secondary level education, senior secondary level education. So this is what is the statistics of the sample related to education. If you come to ask the age of the sample, 14 years, 13 years, 20 years, 25 years, 40 years, 45 years. This is the property or the characteristics of the sample. Okay? Individual to individual, it will keep varying. So that is what is the demographic variables, and these variables are also called the sample characteristics. So age हो गया, gender हो गया, socio educational status हो गया, income हो गया, source of informations हो गए. Okay, there are many things are there, family background हो गया. So these are all also are the attributes or properties or characteristics of the individual samples in your study, which is again having an association with the pre-test scores as well as association with the post-test scores, and that is why you find out the chi-square value. Before giving the intervention, along with the pretest score, what is an association with the demographic variable? After giving the intervention, conducting the post-test, what is the association between the post-test and the demographic variables? Clear? Simple example, when you had come in the first year, you were a novice person in nursing, right? You were not knowing what is nursing, what are the ethics of the nursing and the different subjects and all those things. So you think now, what was your thinking or your imagination about nursing when you have joined first? And when you will complete your nursing, you just recall what all things you have learned in nursing, experiences you have gained. Okay, and you do a association on the first day of joining to the college. Your knowledge, your attitude, your practice related to nursing or your imagination or idea or concept related to nursing was what? Find out a association, and after fourth year you complete, again you do the post test and then you find out the association. There will be a vast change in that. Okay. Now the example is same thing as I told you, gender, subject, height, weight, blood group, blood pressure, all these things. Assumption. What is assumption? Assumptions are the universal truth. It can be universal truth, or you have assumed something before doing the empirical testing, before doing the research. Like for example, you are assuming, when we write the assumptions, always you remember it should be written with the word may, M-A-Y, may. Okay, so you can say that the spoken English or the fluency of the English may be good of those students who have convent educated than that of the public school or any other government school educated. See, may what I have put. Another assumption is what? This is you have assumed कि ऐसा हो सकता है कि जो जिन बच्चों ने इंग्लिश मीडियम स्कूल से पढ़े हैं, कॉन्वेंट से पढ़े हैं, उनकी इंग्लिश की जो लेवल है दैट इज कंपैरेटिवली हायर than that of the other students who have not educated studied from the convent school. दूसरी assumption हो सकती है, it is a universal truth. For example, sun rises in the east. Do you need to prove it again? It is already been proved in the BCs. So this is again, you are not going to write may with that. Sun may be rising in the east. No, sun rises in the east. A day consists of 24 hours. These are the universal truth. Okay. So that is what you have to see, that there are some assumptions which we are quoting even if you have not done the empirical testing, but according to you, it may be like this. And those assumptions which have been universally proven, you are just writing the assumption as a statement form without using any maybe or will be, something like that. Okay. Now, what is the uses of assumptions in the research? Research built upon assumptions since foundation is needed to move forward. Without assumptions, you cannot move forward in your research study. And you have to have some assumptions in your study. Based on this, I am connecting this to this thing. That is what is the assumption. Okay. Assumption listed research paper may be good source of the research topics. You should have assumptions in your thesis, in your project. That is what you might have all written assumptions in the chapter 1. You have to write that. Assumptions provide basis to conduct the research study, and assumptions are overt and innate belief, okay, held by the researcher. It is either an overt or an innate belief of the researcher. Sometimes I told you assumptions are not being empirically tested, but it is you who have believed it innately or overtly, and that is what you are going to quote in your research study. What is limitation? Limitations are the restrictions, okay, within a research study which reduce the credibility or generalizability of the research findings. The limitations of the research studies are also called as weak points of the study. As I told you, there are certain extraneous variables, environmental variables, demographic variables which are not within your control, and it will have an impact on your research study. That means it is your limitation, as I told you before. Second, you are conducting a study in your own setting, maybe in Amroha district, or maybe in Muradabad, or maybe in any part of the UP. So your study findings also will get generalized only within that part. You cannot generalize it for the entire group of people all over India. Yes, so that is your limitation. If you do some kind of studies where you are going to involve the entire part of India's population, okay, as a sample for your study, then you can generalize it. So that is again your limitation. You are doing the study with maybe certain group of students of certain class. So that is again limitation. You are not taking the entire class students. You have selected maybe 25% of the students of the class based on the main strength of the student. So that is what is your assumption. Limitations. Okay. So limitations are something which is not within your control, and your study is bounded or confined to certain areas. So you cannot do the generalization of the study for the entire population of the entire country. Okay. So with this we have completed your hypothesis, limitations, assumptions and variables.